Hey guys, and welcome back to another True Crime Tuesday. But before we get into today's case, I just want to do the usual. So if you're new here, my name's Amber. I upload beauty, fashion and lifestyle content, and on Tuesday I like to combine true crime and makeup and do my makeup while I discuss a true crime case. Now, I always mention that I wasn't the first to invent this. I do actually watch an American YouTuber called Bailey Sarian, who is absolutely incredible, and I believe she was the first person to do the concept on YouTube. So I've just been inspired by her to put my own spin on it, basically. I always like to mention her because she is my inspiration. I also want to quickly mention that I do not mean any disrespect to anyone mentioned in any of these cases. I've literally just gone on the internet and compiled together everything from lots of different sources to create this educational video for you guys. I just want to quickly mention that this video does contain adult references. Obviously we're going to be discussing crimes. There is a little bit of adult language in this one as well, there's a lot of adult themes running through it, so if that isn't for you, then just click off this video. You can go over to my channel and there's plenty of other videos on there for you guys to watch. And today's video is going to be about the mysterious death of Hollywood actress Natalie Wood. Now, I'd not really heard a lot of Natalie Wood before I started researching this case, and the more I dug deeper into her life, the more I began to admire her. And honestly, like, it's so sad that she died in this unfortunate manner, and she was incredible, really. Like, she achieved so much in her life and she was such an incredible person, and I don't know, I just felt this sort of connection to her as I was researching her. I feel like she had so much more to give. So on November 29th 1981, the body of actress Natalie Wood was found floating in the Pacific Ocean off of California's Catalina Island. She was wearing a flannel nightgown, a down jacket, woolen socks, and her death still remains unsolved to this day. Now, before I get into the rest of the case and what happened when she passed away, I actually really want to go into detail on her life, and her life is actually really interesting. There's a lot of things that happen during her life that make her death that much more sad, and I just feel like with Natalie, from what I've gathered from documentaries and things that I've watched, she's always been remembered for her death, and I feel like it would be nice for me to talk about her life just before going into talking about her death, so you can really get to know her as a person and get to know some of the incredible films and just the incredible talent that she really was. Natalie Wood was actually born Natalia Nikolvina Zarenko. I hope I got that right. She was born on the 20th of July 1938 in San Francisco, and her parents were actually both Russian immigrants. But it was really funny because Natalie's parents had both fled to America individually with their families, and they literally just on chance later met in California and then they married. Natalie was a Russian American actress who began her career in film and became a Hollywood star. She received more than 3 Oscar nominations by the time she was 25, and at that point in time it was actually a record, and she held the record until quite recently when it was broken by Shailene Woodley and Jennifer Lawrence, who both achieved 3 nominations by the time they were 23. And just to quickly mention, Natalie's parents were called Nikolai and Maria. I did forget to mention that at the beginning. In her youth, Natalie's mother herself had dreamed of becoming an actress or a ballet dancer. It's believed that Maria then transferred this dream onto her daughter. Maria took Natalie to the movies as often as she possibly could, and Natalie's only professional training was from watching Hollywood child stars from her mother's lap, which is incredible when you think about what she goes on to achieve. Natalie, when she was older, then went on to recall what her mother would say to her, and her mother used to say to her that the cameraman who pointed the lens out at the audience at the end of the Paramount newsreel was taking her picture. She'd pause and smile like he was going to make her famous or something. I believed everything my mother told me. Her mother told her one day she was going to be a star, and I suppose with her mother's persistence, pushing her daughter forward, that came true. So shortly after Natalie was born, the family moved to Santa Rosa, and there was a rumour swirling around town that they were looking to cast a child. There was lots of mothers and daughters and mothers and sons that ran down to this film set in order to try and get cast, and it wasn't long before Natalie was noticed by members of the crew. The director Irving Pitchell actually spotted Natalie in the audience. She landed the part. When she was pulled out of the audience by him, she basically sat on his lap, threw her arms around him and began to sing. And this, I think, basically just stole Irving's heart, and she got cast in the role. It was literally a few weeks before her 5th birthday, so she officially started acting at the age of 4. Natalie made her film debut as a character actress. It was literally a 15-second role, that was it, in the film Happy Land. So in this film, basically, they were just looking for a child to come out of this shop and drop her ice cream cone on the floor, and that was all she had to do. And that's what Natalie did. After this, Irving Pitchell actually remained in contact with the family, and he remained in contact with the family for a further 2 years, and up until this point nothing had really come up. He used to send her like birthday gifts, so he was really good to the family. But as soon as a role come up that he thought was right for Natalie, he telephoned her mother and was like, look, we've got this part that we think she'll be perfect for, bring her down for a screen test. Natalie's mother then became so excited that she actually packed off the whole family and upped and moved to Los Angeles to live so Natalie could fulfill a film career, and I suppose so she could live out her childhood dream that she never got to achieve. At least her daughter could. Not long after the move, Natalie's mother fell pregnant and had another daughter. She became known in the movie world. She was actually an actress herself, and she became known as Lana Wood. After Natalie started acting as a child, studio executives at Archeo Radio Pictures changed her name. So originally, obviously, like I said, she was named Natalie Nikolvina Zarenko, and this wasn't very, it didn't roll off the tongue. It wasn't very friendly in the film industry. It wasn't a friendly name that you could, you know, it wasn't easily memorable. It wasn't something that you could easily pronounce. So they changed her name to Natalie Wood in reference to director Sam Wood, because this way it was more westernized, more American friendly, and it just was easier for people to remember. It was more catchy, if you like. Natalie did not like this, to say the least. She didn't mind Natalie because it was very similar to her actual name. She hated the surname Wood, but it stuck. Natalie then went on to land the role that she had gone to LA to audition for. She ended up playing a German orphan alongside Orson Welles in the film Tomorrow Is Forever. Orson Welles actually went on to comment on how incredible Natalie's acting ability was. He actually claimed that she was, quote, so good she was terrifying, end quote. I mean, at this point, she's not that old. And to be that good at that age without any actual training, with purely just watching movies, this girl was good. She had something. The only problem was, upon filming this movie, an issue occurred on set. Natalie was asked to cry on cue for a scene, and when she was asked to do so, she was struggling. She managed to, but it wasn't the emotion they were looking for. They wanted more. So Maria would literally do anything to encourage her daughter Natalie to act better or, you know, fulfill the scene. So then Maria went on to shout behind the camera, "Think about the dead dog." Now, Natalie had actually lost a pet dog in a car accident. I mean, shouting that at a child, appropriate? Maybe not. She did cry. Natalie went on to cry, but it just wasn't enough. It still wasn't enough emotion. It wasn't the emotion they were looking for. The same day, Natalie had actually arrived on set with a butterfly in a jar. She was, you know, happy-go-lucky. She loved animals, so she would never like to see anything done to them. So that's why, you know, talking about her dog did hurt her and upset her. So she'd brought this butterfly on set in a jar. This just, like, blows my mind. Her mother took her aside because she still wasn't crying enough, opened up the jar, took out the butterfly, and basically pulled it apart in front of Natalie's eyes. Needless to say, it did the job. She rushed Natalie back onto set when Natalie was in floods of tears to finish filming the scene, and it worked. Her mother then signed Natalie to 20th Century Fox, and she went on to bag her first major movie role, and this could possibly be argued that it's her most famous movie role, and most people have heard of it. Probably nearly everyone's watched it, and that is the Christmas classic Miracle on 34th Street, which was released in 1947. Natalie was counted as one of the top Hollywood child stars after this film, so it really cemented her fame as a child star within the industry. Because Natalie at the time was only a minor, the studio had to be very careful with regards to how much time she spent on set for legal requirements. So she received primary education while at the studio. This was a state law in California. It's required that until the age of 18, child actors had to spend at least 3 hours per day in the classroom. Natalie was a very bright young girl. She was a straight A student, and later on in life she went on to reflect about this time period in her life, and she said, quote, "I always felt guilty when I knew the crew was sitting around waiting around for me to finish my 3 hours. As soon as the teacher let us go, I ran for set as soon as I could." End quote. Now I'm just going to discuss a little bit about Natalie's fear, or should I say Natalie's biggest fear, which then went on to be her cause of death, which is so horrific and so terrifying to think that this poor woman had feared this all of her life, and then it then went on to be her reason of death. So as a child, Natalie was absolutely terrified of water, and it didn't help that on a few movie sets, on quite a few occasions, there were water-related accidents on the movie set she was on. When Natalie's mother Maria was a young child, she actually went to see a fortune teller, and the fortune teller told her that her second child would be a great beauty and famous, but that she should be aware of dark water. As you're aware by now, Natalie went on to drown. Her greatest fear then became the fact that she was afraid she was going to die in dark water, because she'd been told by her mother what the fortune teller had told her years earlier. Her mother, from lots of different interviews, was very manipulative, and she was very good at planting seeds. I think she used to whisper quite a lot in Natalie's ear to her mother's advantage, if that makes sense. She was very manipulative. I don't necessarily think this is something she needed to tell her daughter, to be quite honest. In a later interview which I watched, she actually went on to say, quote, "I've always been terrified and still am of water, dark water, sea water, or river water." It's horrifying to think that she later succumbed to this fear. I'm just going to quickly go on, before we get back to the timeline of her life, I just want to quickly go on to mention a few incidences on sets where she had these water related accidents. So one of them was while shooting the film The Green Promise, a young Natalie had to walk over a bridge during a thunderstorm. When she did, the technician actually flipped the switch early, and the bridge collapsed, throwing Natalie into treacherous waters and damaging her wrist. Now, everyone on set had believed that Natalie had escaped the incident unscathed. It later became clear that she actually had a splinter lodged in the wrist, where she'd obviously caught it when she'd fell, and this splinter actually became infected. And from what I've sort of gathered, her mother she wanted Natalie to battle on, and her mother didn't want her daughter to be made a fuss of. She wanted to be seen as a real professional actress. So when the accident initially happened, her mother actually basically told Natalie to get up and get on with it, and didn't seek medical attention. So for years after, well, for the rest of her life, once her wrist actually healed, she was left with a visible large bump on her left wrist, which she covered with bracelets for the rest of her life because it made her very self-conscious. And you can actually see it in some pictures. There's very far and few between because she did cover it very often, but you can see it sometimes. So then another incident occurred in 1952 when she went on to star alongside Bette Davis as Bette Davis's daughter. While filming The Star in 1952 on a freezing January morning, the director Stuart Heisler wanted Natalie to leap over the railing of a private yacht. Now, I'm not being funny. If you are someone who is terrified of water, the last thing you want to be doing is jumping off a boat. As you can imagine, Natalie was absolutely petrified. She didn't really want to do this. So at this point, she's ready to shoot this scene, even though she's petrified, and you've got Stuart Heisler, the director, basically yelling at her, just jump. But before she could jump, Heisler's also yelling, basically, don't worry about it, the men in rowboats will pick you up. That's no comfort to someone who was absolutely petrified of jumping off this railing. When she hit the water, she panicked and she let out an incredibly intense scream. She was screaming and it was clear she was absolutely terrified. And Bette Davis actually threatened to quit the production unless they made a stunt double stand in for Natalie and do the scene again, because there was no way she was going to witness this poor girl going through one of her greatest fears like that again. It was just awful to watch. The strange thing about this occurrence was when they actually reshot the scene, the stunt double became entangled in kelp and nearly drowned. That is just bizarre. And to top it all off, they actually cut the scene from the film after all that. So then in 1961, while filming Splendour in the Grass, another incident occurs. So at this point, she's working with a director called Eli Kazan, and she made Eli aware of the fact she was petrified of water. She drew it to his attention, and they were supposed to be shooting this reservoir scene for the film. So a day before they're supposed to be shooting this reservoir scene, Natalie actually approaches Kazan. She confided in him that she had a really deep-seated terror of water, particularly dark water, and that she felt helpless in it. She basically just didn't feel comfortable doing the scene in open water. She was really frightened of it. So Natalie asked him if it could be shot in a small studio tank, but the director refused. He explained that the reservoir was shallow and that her feet wouldn't touch the bottom. I don't think she was concerned about her feet touching the bottom. I think she was just concerned about being in the water. She wasn't particularly reassured, but obviously, being the actress she was, carried on and filmed the scene. And she did film the scene incredibly well. She did, I believe, go on to win awards for her role in this film, so I'm glad she did. She deserved it after all of that terrifying incident. Kazan actually remembered that after she'd filmed the scene, Natalie got out of the water and she shivered with fear and laughed hysterically with relief. Then again, later on in her career, she has yet another incident. So in 1965, Natalie had yet another heart-stopping moment at sea. She was filming a scene with Robert Redford in Santa Monica Bay, inside Daisy Clover, and a giant rogue wave suddenly reared up. So this giant rogue wave comes up and it actually separates Natalie and Robert from the crew and the technicians. And the director of the movie of the time actually turned around and said, quote, "There was no way we could get Natalie and Robert off the boat, and the lines to keep them in place kept breaking right and left." Robert went on to say that he thought the whole thing was just a bit of an escapade, but he could really tell that Natalie was terrified. I mean, some of these incidences would be terrifying for people who aren't scared of water, let alone people who were terrified of water. So now we're just going to get back to a little bit more about Natalie's life and continue her timeline. So in 1956, Natalie actually graduated high school and she decides to sign with Warner Brothers. She continually gets cast in this stereotypical girlfriend role, and this leaves her feeling unsatisfied. You know, she feels like she's so much more than just someone's girlfriend. She managed to successfully make the transition from child star at the age of 16 when she lands a role in Rebel with a Cause alongside James Dean, and this actually went on to be James Dean's final movie, because he was not long after this tragically killed in a car accident. This film is about a teenage rebellion against parents, and it was the perfect opportunity for her to steer away from this child star image that she'd become known for. Her parents, however, particularly Maria, weren't keen on her taking this part, but Natalie insisted and really wanted the part. She wanted to break through and really show her flexibility and her acting ability. So the director of the film, Nicholas Ray, at the beginning didn't feel like Natalie was right for the role. He turned her down on several attempts. She did roll calls several times and he just was like, you're not quite right for the role. At this point she still had her like cute child star image, and he just wasn't quite sure how that was going to work out and how she was going to manage to shed that. He seemed to be concerned that she was too innocent. However, that didn't stop 44-year-old Nicholas Ray, Natalie, who at the time was only 16. There was sexual liaisons between the pair. I think they carried out an affair throughout the production of the film. This still wasn't enough for her to land the role though, and she was actually on a drunken night out with Dennis Hopper, who she was sort of dating at the same time she was seeing Nicholas. They end up in a car accident, and when this accident occurs, who does she call? Not her parents, no, Nicholas Ray. So Nicholas turns up at the hospital and the doctor's actually having a conversation with Natalie, and the doctor turns to Natalie and says, "You're a goddamn juvenile delinquent." She then turns round and yells to Nicholas, "Did you hear that? Did you hear what he called me, Nick? He called me a goddamn juvenile delinquent. Now do I get the part?" And this seemed to work. Now, whether this was the reason why she landed the role or not, Nicholas did go on to write a memo to Warner Brothers that read, "We just spent 3 days testing 32 kids. There is only one girl who has shown the capacity to play Judy, and that is Natalie Wood." It was a wise decision on Nicholas's part, because the teenager then went on to receive the first of her 3 Oscar nominations. Natalie then had sort of a little bit of a dry spell and had a series of bad films, not as successful films. This girl's still very, very young, but she's already getting called a washed up actress. Her career was beginning to decline and people were trying to imply that her career was it was over and done with, she was finished, and she wasn't taking it lightly. Basically, she wasn't a washed up actress, she was so much more than that. Eli Kazan then decides to give her a shot, and he decides he's going to take a chance on Natalie, and it's for the role in Splendour in the Grass, which I was chatting about earlier. He casts her as the leading female alongside Warren Beatty. After the release of the film, Natalie's career then rebounded. Kazan had done her a massive favour, and this role was very impactful on her career. He wanted to take a chance on Natalie because he felt that despite her early innocent roles, she had the talent and the maturity to go above and beyond them. That she did. Kazan later went on to say, "When I saw her, I detected the well-mannered young wife, front a desperate twinkle in her eyes. I talked with her more quietly and more personally. I wanted to find out what human material was there, what her inner life was. Then she told me she was being psychoanalyzed. That did it. Poor RJ," referring to Robert Wagner, who we're going to talk about in a minute. "I said to myself, I like Bob Wagner. I still do," end quote. Natalie actually married Robert Wagner at the age of 18. He was 26 at the time. The two had been basically set up by the studio to gain publicity, because I think they'd been in a few things together, but it actually worked and the two fell in love. Robert Wagner was a successful actor himself. Now, the two married in 1957, but they divorced 5 years later. The thing that I found so sweet was Natalie actually recalled being 10 years old and she was walking through one of the studio lots, and she recalled telling her mum, "When I grow up, I want to marry him." And I just thought that is just like, that's fate, isn't it? They were just meant to be together. So following this starter marriage, Wood actually did go on to date some fairly big names. She dated Warren Beatty, she dated Michael Caine, among others. She had actually, previous to her marriage, dated Elvis Presley as well, and she also then in 1965 went on to have a broken engagement with a shoe manufacturer called Ladislav Blatnik. She she just was trying to find her way a little bit and figure out who she was, because being on movie sets all of her life, you know, she's not really had time to find out who she is herself. So I think she needed some time to do a little bit of self-discovery. So then in 1961 she went on to star in another one of her major roles, and that was in the film West Side Story, as well as going on to star in Gypsy in 1962. So although many of Natalie's films were very commercially successful, her acting was quite heavily criticised at times, and people questioned whether she was actually a good actress. And then in 1966, Wood actually won a Harvard Lampoon Award, and this was for being the worst actress of last year, this year and next year. And what I loved about her reaction to this was she took this on the chin, and she basically actually was the first person to attend the ceremony and accept the award personally, which I thought was incredible. She took this on the chin, didn't take it to heart. Then following the disappointing reception from the film Penelope, Natalie decided she was going to take a 3-year hiatus from acting. She needed a break. I think she needed to give herself a chance to refresh. I feel like I've not organised this timeline in the best way. It is a little bit all over the place, but I'm just trying to cram as much in about her life as I possibly can. So over the years, due to a number of factors, Natalie struggled with her mental health, and in 1964 she was having a really tough time while filming The Great Race. She was lonely and unhappy, and she was scared she wouldn't be able to find a happy and stable relationship. So she actually overdosed and took enough sleeping pills to try and kill herself. At the time, Natalie's friend Gregson Wagner was staying over at her residence. So after she'd downed the sleeping pills, she quickly realised the mistake that she'd made, and she ran to Wagner's door and banged on the door for help, explaining what she'd done, realising she wanted to live and that she'd made such a big mistake. She was rushed to the hospital where they pumped her stomach, and she was actually lucky to survive the ordeal. Now, Natalie was quite close friends with actress Mia Farrow, and Mia Farrow said that she believed that Natalie had issues going way back that she possibly hadn't confronted or had chance to deal with. It was alleged that Natalie was raped by a powerful and well-known star when she was just 16 years old, and it was a terrible ordeal that lasted hours. And Natalie's family knew of the alleged attack, but they never confronted him or went public with her claims. And I'm not going to name the actor in this video. The alleged actor's name has been released, faced any consequences for this act, and I pray to God that he didn't do this to any other girls, because poor Natalie, like, her and herself is disgusting, but it seemed to me that this implies he was maybe preying on other girls in Hollywood young girls in Hollywood circles, but I don't know, I can't say for sure. So Natalie had also confided in several friends about the ordeal, and she was scared to go to the police in case it would ruin her career. In those days, stars were basically owned by their studio, so they could pick you up and drop you as they pleased, and her co-star and friend Dennis Hopper actually completely and utterly agreed with her in the fact that he just didn't know what it would do for her career. And, you know, powerful people have friends in powerful places is all I'm going to say. So as I began to dig a little bit deeper into Natalie's childhood and young adult life, it appeared that all wasn't as it seemed, and this beautiful child actress that had grew up into this incredible woman, her childhood wasn't to envy as you would assume. You know, you would look at her on the outside looking and thinking, oh my god, she had this incredible career and blah blah blah, but you know, she did pay the price for some of that in her life. Most people didn't realise the demons that Natalie had to struggle with. There was family violence, an alcoholic father, a pathological attachment to her mother who she relied on so heavily. You know, her mother had ingrained this attachment, and her mother was a very manipulative person. She had psychological abuse as a child star, she had paranoias and phobias, years. She was pimped at aged 15 to Frank Sinatra, which is just absolutely disgraceful. She was forced to return an engagement ring to her high school sweetheart, who tried to kill himself afterwards. She was exploited into a sexual liaison as a 16-year-old girl with 44-year-old Nicholas Ray to prove that she could land the part of a bad girl in Rebel without a cause. All of this took its toll on her, and it led to a lifetime of psychological damage and abuse, which led to multiple suicide attempts by Natalie, and daily psychoanalysis, and the fear of being alone at night so primal and deep-seated that she regressed into her child self. So a lot of those things were actually noted in a biography done about Natalie by Suzanne Finstead, and I've got to say that book's an interesting read. It gives you a deeper dive into a lot of the dark goings on of Natalie's life that probably weren't openly published, and I just found it really interesting to get a different spin on things, really. You know, back in those days things were more openly accepted than what they are now. That's not to say that it was right or to say that it is right. I think things were swept under the rug a lot easier back then, and they got away with a lot more. Maybe certain situations weren't thought of as they are now. I still just think the whole thing's a bit effed up, to be quite honest. But now I'm just going to continue on with her timeline. So on the 30th of May 1969, Natalie then marries British producer Richard Gregson after dating for nearly 3 years. And in 1970 they actually have a daughter, and they name her Natasha, and Natasha was actually Natalie's nickname as a child, so they name her after Natalie's nickname, which is really sweet. At this point Natalie decides she wants to focus a little bit more on her family and take a little bit of time out. She sort of goes into like a partial semi-retirement. She then begins to turn down quite a lot of movie roles to try and focus more on her family, and she decides to look more at television roles. And I think this is probably because with movies you can be on sets for months on end, where with television maybe it's not as demanding, and that's why she looked at that sort of area for her career to move forward, especially while she was trying to focus on her daughter Natasha. Natalie and Richard, their marriage only lasts a couple of years and they divorce in 1972, and this is actually because he was being unfaithful and Richard was actually having an affair with Natalie's secretary. She was like, I recall him, it was his last ever interview he did, and he was talking about their relationship, and she literally was like, get out. He was like, your mother was beautiful, but when she kicked off, you basically knew she kicked off, like in his own words. So as her divorce to Richard is being finalised, she actually rekindles her romance with Robert Wagner, who she'd previously married. And so they literally remarried 5 months after she was divorced in July of 1972. They have this really cutesy ceremony on like a boat, and then in 1974 they have a daughter together named Courtney. Natalie then continued to make her family her main focus. She really wanted a really nice family life, and she wanted to be the best wife and mother that she possibly could be. She also was struggling to find roles. At this point she's in her 40s and Hollywood would class her as past her prime. Natalie and Robert were actually married until her death in 1981. She was just 43 years old when she passed away. It is clear by now that she had a obvious fear of water, but she loved boats, and her and Robert actually had their own private boat. They had a yacht named Splendor after the movie Natalie had starred in, Splendor in the Grass, and this was one of her, you know, biggest achievements. She was really proud of it, so that's why they named the boat after it. They would often take the boat out with family and friends, and her sister Lana said, quote, yes, the boat was in water, but she wasn't. She was alright as long as she wasn't swimming, end quote. So, you know, she was fine with being on board, she just didn't like the surrounding water. The surrounding water frightened her. So at the time of her death, she was working on a movie called Brainstorm with Christopher Walken, and this would actually sadly become her last film. The film was nearly scrapped due to Natalie's death, but luckily she had already filmed all of her major scenes, and the studio decided to complete and release the film, and her sister Lana Wood actually stood in for the like sections of the film that Natalie never got to film, which was really nice. The last thing she'd ever filmed did actually get released. So it's November 1981 and the cast of Brainstorm were on a production break. Natalie decided, due to it being like around the time of Thanksgiving, Natalie decides to invite lots of friends, family members, crew and cast basically aboard a boat to spend the weekend with her and her husband on the boat, sorry, and they were going to go on like a boat trip to Catalina, and most people they invited actually declined their invite except for her co-star from Brainstorm, Christopher Walken. We're actually going to we're getting into the nitty-gritty of sort of things, and we're going to get into what actually happened on the day of Natalie's death. So this first version of events that I'm going to run through with you are the official version of events. So Natalie's on her yacht just off Catalina Island with her husband Robert and Christopher Walken, along with the boat's captain Dennis Deverne. So Natalie had left a note for her husband Robert to let him know that she took the dinghy over to the mainland with Christopher and they were going to go to a restaurant on the island. She'd also wrote in the note to tell him to come and join them. So Natalie and Christopher had spent hours at Catalina Island before Robert had showed up. They'd been doing a bit of shopping, just a little bit of looking around, and all of them then went to dinner at Doug's Harbour restaurant, where they shared a bottle of champagne, 2 bottles of wine and cocktails. They'd been drinking pretty much all day and didn't leave the restaurant until around 10 p.m. They were very much intoxicated, and a restaurant employee had noted that one of them had thrown a glass at a wall at some point. So it was clear that they were very, very drunken. They then head back to the boat on Friday night, and Natalie and Robert argued to the point where Dennis was so concerned that he actually asked Christopher to get involved, to which Christopher responded, quote, "Never get involved in an argument between a man and his wife," end quote. Robert was apparently mad because Natalie had been flirting with Christopher. Something was clearly in the air and something had clearly pissed Robert off. This then led to an argument between Robert and Christopher. Robert broke a wine bottle over the table. Robert told police that this had actually happened due to rough seas because he didn't want to admit that he'd smashed it, but he did later go on to reveal in his 2009 biography that he had broken the wine bottle. So Natalie had decided that she was going to retire around 11:45 p.m. She decided to go back to her cabin. So then Robert and Christopher actually sat together for a little while longer until Robert decided that he was going to go and join his wife and retire to bed. Upon retiring to bed, he realised that Natalie wasn't in a cabin and she was actually missing. So Robert then starts to look around the yacht and there's no sign of her, and they realise that the dinghy that is attached to the boat is also missing. Robert waits a little while, assuming that maybe she's gone back to the mainland. She's probably gotten sick of the arguing and decided to get the dinghy to shore. A radio call for help is made around 1:30 a.m. and he did wait a while before calling help. The Coast Guard isn't alerted till 3:30, which is hours after she was last seen. So then Harbour Patrol, private searchers and the Coast Guard all comb the water and island coastline, and the Sheriff's Department helicopter eventually spotted Natalie's floating body. Natalie was pronounced dead at 7:44 on November 29, 1981. So 6 hours after she'd gone missing, her body was found floating a mile away from the yacht. She was wearing her nightgown, socks and a red down jacket. Inflatable dinghy that everyone thought she presumably left the boat on was also found a little bit further south on the rocks. The ignition was off, the gear was set to neutral and the oars were locked, which implied that the vessel was never started. Suspicious. The coroner reported that she drunk 7 or 8 glasses of wine before the incident. She was found to have a blood alcohol level of 0.14%, which is fairly drunk. It's very drunk. She was also found to have a motion sickness pill and a painkiller in her system, which can increase the effects of alcohol. Well, they're known to increase the effects of alcohol. She also had superficial bruises on her arms and lower legs and a cut on her cheek. At the time, the coroner ruled the death as accidental due to drowning. The police released a statement to say Natalie could have ended up in the water due to potential slipping. So a few days after Natalie's death, a couple actually come forward as witnesses. John Payne and his girlfriend at the time, Marilyn Wayne, were sleeping aboard a nearby boat, and they reported hearing shout around midnight. So John claimed that he heard a woman yelling, quote, "Help, someone please help me," coming from the stern of the Splendor. He believed to hear a man also who sounded very drunk respond, quote, "Okay honey, we'll get you," and the tone was very mocking. However, there was a party going on nearby, so he basically figured that it was from that, and that, so he just didn't respond. What really happened that night remains one of Hollywood's greatest mysteries, but many people highly dispute the police's verdict that Natalie's death was an accidental death. So now I'm just going to go into a few different theories. Like I say, Natalie's case is still an unsolved case, so these are all just theories of things that could have happened that led to her unfortunate death. The first theory is that Natalie got sick of the arguments aboard the ship, and she was deciding that she was going to go and head for the island, and due to her blood alcohol level, she probably thought that it was a good idea at the time. You know, we've all had those drunken stupors where we've thought something seems like a great idea, and then it's just, in reality, when you sober up, it's really just not. From the physical evidence in Natalie's case, Noguchi, who was the, I believe, the coroner at the time, concluded that the actress had fallen in the water while trying to board the dinghy. Fingernail scratches on the Valiant's side showed she'd tried to hoist herself up from the water, but since the down jacket would quickly have become waterlogged, she was probably impeded by extra weight. Obviously, she wouldn't think to remove the jacket if she was under the influence, and because her judgment was clouded by alcohol, she didn't remove her jacket. She clung to the dinghy's side as it drifted away from the Splendor and other boats in the harbour until finally she was overcome by exhaustion and hypothermia and she drowned. Although this is disputed by Dennis, who was the ship's captain, because he believed that if Natalie was to decide to return to shore that night, he would have asked her. He had on like previous occasions asked her to return to shore, you know, maybe if it was like a rocky night or something and she didn't want to stay on the boat. So Dennis heavily disputes that she would have just got on the boat and done so, but I can agree with him to an extent. But when you are in that frame of mind and you've had a few too many to drink, maybe you wouldn't be thinking logically like that. He also said, quote, "If the stars are out, it's total darkness. There's no place to go. Darkness all around. I wouldn't go out at night." So he was saying that he wouldn't use the Valiant to go out at night. So then the second theory is that Natalie had basically become fed up of all the arguments that were going on the boat, and that she decided to retire to bed. But upon retiring to bed, she could hear the banging of the dinghy up, because obviously the dinghy was tied on ropes, and if the dinghy had become loose, she could hear it banging up against the side of the boat, which was starting to peer off. So obviously, not being in a particularly amazing frame of mind due to the fact that she was again under the influence of alcohol, she decided to go out and try and retie the dinghy to the boat herself. You know, if she'd been arguing with her husband, she's not going to go to her husband and ask him to tie it to the boat. So Robert did go on to say that, quote, "Natalie sat there not saying much of anything and looking bored. She left us and we sat there talking for almost an hour. Then I went to kiss her goodnight and found her missing." So Robert later went on to say, quote, "It was only after I was told she was dressed in a sleeping gown, heavy socks and a parka that it dawned on me what had really occurred. Natalie obviously had trouble sleeping with that dinghy slamming up against the boat. It happened many times before. I'd always gone out and pulled the rope tighter to keep the dinghy flush against the yacht. She probably skidded on one of those steps after untying the rope. The steps are slick as ice because of the algae and seaweed that's always clinging to them. After slipping on the steps, she hit her head against the boat. I only hope she was unconscious when she hit the water." Bit of a strange statement, but hey. However, some have criticised this theory, and the Valiant was a rubber dinghy. According to Noguchi, the dinghy would have made little noise when bumping a yacht. Additionally, Noguchi reported that forensic evidence, including untouched algae on the swim step, it appeared that Wood may have been attempting to board the dinghy rather than adjust the rope. If she was trying to adjust the rope, she'd have probably stepped down onto the swim step, as Robert had suggested, to pull the ropes in, but there was no sign that she had disturbed any of the algae that was there, which that didn't seem like it was the plausible reason to how she died. Then we move on to the third and final theory. So in 2011, it was nearing the 30th anniversary of Natalie's death, and due to new information, the case was then reopened to be reinvestigated. The new information had actually come from captain of the yacht, Dennis Deverne, who had written and released a book, and he admitted to lying about the events of the night. Natalie's death was then changed from an accidental drowning to death and undetermined factors. The case was reopened in November 2011 after Captain Dennis Deverne admitted that he'd lied in his initial investigation. This time, Dennis alleged that Robert Wagner was responsible for Natalie's death. So he was saying that Robert was responsible for his own wife's death. And the third theory is that there was foul play involving Robert Wagner. It's worth knowing that Dennis is or can be classed as a slightly unreliable, or, well, slightly, very, however you want to judge the situation, unreliable witness for various reasons. The first reason was that it took him almost 30 years to come forward to change his statement of events and to come forward with what he says is the truth of what happened. Secondly, he did release bits of the information to the press in an unsavoury manner, so I think he was leaking. So Captain Dennis went on to say that the weekend was filled with arguments, basically from start to finish, and the major issue was the glaring flirtation between Christopher Watkin and Natalie. And he said, quote, "The argument started the day before," said Dennis. "The tension was through the whole weekend. Robert Wagner was jealous of Christopher Watkin," end quote. Dennis claimed that Wagner smashed a wine bottle in jealous rage over Natalie and Christopher's interactions, which we do know he did smash a wine bottle. Why he did that, we don't, but we definitely do know that he did, because he did go on to admit that himself in his own autobiography. He claimed that the interaction between Watkin and Natalie really enraged Wagner, and it's alleged that Wagner said, quote, "Jesus Christ, what are you trying to do? Fuck my wife," end quote. Dennis remembered Christopher Watkin then going back to his cabin, and at this point that was the last time he saw Christopher. He seemed to just retire to bed. Robert and Natalie then returned to their room after the incident, and Dennis says that he remained on the bridge, which was located over Robert and Natalie's stateroom, so he could hear the couple basically fighting like mad. He said, "I'd never in a million years seen them fight like that before. I just couldn't believe it, you know, stuff getting thrown around. It was a ferocious argument fueled by drink so hot and heavy that it got carried out into the cockpit and at the rear of the yacht." Deverne says he next heard the dinghy being untied, so he said that you can hear the ropes, the bowline basically being tugged off. The last words that Dennis heard Robert say to Natalie were, quote, "Get off my fucking boat," end quote. And then Deverne says there was just silence. Everything just went quiet. And he said it seemed like a long time before Robert appeared, tussled, sweating profusely, as if he had been in some sort of terrible fight or an ordeal. He came back to the bridge where he and Robert then sat and emptied another bottle of wine. And then Dennis says it was around 11:30 when Richard returned. "We went drinking till about 1:30 in the morning. Then RJ said I'd better go and check on Natalie. After a few minutes, Richard appeared and told the captain, 'She's gone, she's gone. Where the hell is she? I don't know.'" Dennis decided that he was going to go and look for her. I can actually just sit and talk to you now. I'm finished. I've actually finished before finishing reading the case, which isn't like me at all. Dennis decided it was a good time to sort of go and look for her, and he said, quote, "I thought maybe she went into the stateroom feeling she could confide in me, so I went up and she's not there. So I looked in the empty stateroom, nothing. I looked in Christopher's stateroom, he's in the top bunk and he's asleep. I looked in his bathroom and thank God she's not in Christopher's room. I knew that wouldn't happen because there's too much rage going on. So I go back up and say she's not down below." Dennis walked out on deck to look for her, and that's when he noticed that the dinghy was gone. And Dennis said that he told Wagner that he was going to turn on the Splendor's floodlights in order to look for her, but Robert told him not to, and he said, Dennis, don't turn that on. Dennis then offered to fire up the Ox engines and cruise around looking for Natalie, and according to Dennis, Robert refused. He said, quote, don't do that, let's think about this. Why don't we want to do anything, Dennis? Because we don't want to alert all these people. And then when later on he was asked on America's Today breakfast TV show if he thought Robert was responsible for Natalie's death, and Dennis replied, quote, yes, I would say so. Yes. People were questioning why he took so long to come forward other than this book, you know, what was the reasoning behind it, and he did later go on to say that he, for a time after this incident, Robert gave him a job, and he used to get like picked up from the studio, dropped off, and he was like living in Robert's house. And he did actually say, quote, when I was at Robert Wagner's house, I was actually there for just about a year. Robert Wagner got me a job at the studio. He was doing the TV series called Heart to Heart. If I would have a morning call or something like that to go to the studio, his driver would pick me up and take me from the house to the studio. At the end of my work day, the driver would bring me back to the house. When I would go to bed for the night, you close the door to my room, and there was sort of a magnetic lock to where you couldn't open the door. I couldn't get myself out of my room. I thought maybe the whole house was this security system. Whether it did or not, I don't know, but to me it was a very locked in feeling. He believes that Robert took him in an effort to bar him from telling the truth about Natalie's incident. So obviously he thought that maybe Robert was taking him in and doing all these things to hush him and keep him quiet. Whether that was the case, I suppose we'll never know unless these people come and speak out. It was quite interesting that a family medicine specialist in LA called Dr. Michael Franco was actually an intern at the LA coroner's office when Natalie Wood's body was flown to Los Angeles Medical Center. Franco has come out and has shared what he saw and what his thoughts and feelings were, and he said Natalie Wood's death was not an accident. Somebody pushed her. I knew it wasn't a simple drowning. She had some abrasions that I could come to the conclusion that she was pushed off whatever she was holding on to. There was no reason to have those unless you're being pushed off a surface, and they were deeper than just a slip off, because there is some back and forth. There is a possibility, what if Robert dropped the dinghy to make it look like Natalie had gone ashore, which was the story he gave to police. Dennis said that he did hear the dinghy being dropped into the water after a terrible fight, he'd overheard on the rear deck, and he saw Robert somewhere near the dinghy. The next time Dennis saw him, he was sweating and looked like he'd been in a struggle, and the dinghy was gone. Okay, so that is all of the theories behind Natalie's death. I'm just going to do a quick summary and sort of my thoughts and feelings. This case is very mysterious, and I'm not 100% sure what to think and what I believe, and it's difficult. It's a real difficult one, because upon reading the evidence and like what the medical coroner and everything said, it does imply that someone, and the only person really with motive on the boat was Robert, had something to do with Natalie's death. There is a lot of it's not just the case that's unsolved, there's a lot of mystery shrouding the case. But then I've watched Robert in interviews, and I recently watched him in the latest interview, which was about Natalie Wood's death. It was like a documentary, and it starred his daughter. His daughter actually like was the interviewer. She interviewed all of the like family members and stuff, and he seemed genuinely absolutely heartbroken and just in distress over the fact that people believed he was involved in his wife's death. But then you could go on to say he has been an actor all of his career, and some people are good actors. I don't know. I genuinely do not know what to believe. I do believe there was something more to it. I do genuinely believe that, and I don't believe she was drunk and tried to get to the shoreline, and I'm not 100% sure I believe she tried to tie the boat up, but I'm also not 100% sure I believe that Wagner intentionally hurt his wife. I possibly think another theory could be they got into a heated argument and she maybe accidentally fell in the water and he panicked, and by the time he could try to save her there was nothing to do. He could do, the current had swept her off and he didn't know what to do. I believe that could be a real good possibility, as to, I don't know, maybe she slipped and he tried to grab her. I don't know, I really don't know, but then that wouldn't explain the cuts and the bruises and the marks and things. Everything's just a big question mark with this one. But I do want to say, regardless of Natalie's death, she was an absolutely incredible actress, and I just feel like a lot of people my age won't probably know about Natalie, and that's such a shame, because she was a star, and she really just didn't deserve this untimely and unfortunate death, and I feel like it's very sad that the death was drowning, which was her biggest fear. It's awful, but I'd love to know what your guys' theories on this one are. Let me know that down below. I do apologise because this one is probably a mega long video, but there was just so much of her life to tell. I didn't feel right just jumping in and discussing her mysterious death without actually letting you know who she was as a person, because I feel like in this case, like I say, that gets looked over quite often. But I would love to know what your theories on this case are. Let me know down below, and I shall see you in the next one.